Okay, so I finished playing. This is something you won't see very often from me, and I'm coming back and going over the rules again. It's really because Sal Vasta is such, I don't know, such a classy guy, basically. And this is a game that I did a real sort of disservice to in my first look at the rules, as I often do with games when I'm trying to muddle through them. The truth of the matter is these rules are a problem for me. For some people, they may be very good. They're very, very concise, very parsimonious. And that means there's not going to be a lot, well, certainly there's not a lot of repetition. And I'm in favor of that. But the particular style they're given in is somewhat similar to Axis Empires. There's not a lot of numerical. You can see quite a few here, but there are sections where there's a decent amount of text that is kind of important. I'm having trouble finding it. That doesn't have a numerical reference to, and maybe it wouldn't quite fit. But I know that I had trouble, for example, in some of the air rules, finding certain things and then found there was no number anywhere near that. For example, air movement prohibitions doesn't have a number to reference anywhere, and there are very few, if any, well, there are definitely some, but there are many fewer cross references than I'd like. In a lot of ways, you're following this flow chart, which I just want to point out again really should be on one of the player aids. It doesn't matter with the print and play, and it doesn't matter if you have a photocopier available. But it's nice. In the eventual product, I hope that there's this kind of extra player aid support for the game in terms of it costs a little more, but it's nice to have the hard cardboard quality or cardstock quality in your player aids. Anyway, outside of that. And I will make public my original look at the rules so you can look and see how I handle that. But let's go over, first of all, some of my thoughts in terms of before I came to the game. This particular game didn't terribly interest me. What does is what it's the prelude to. Okay, so this is a print and play version of something called Unconditional Surrender that's currently on P500. And I put my order in pretty much on reading what it was about and knowing, beyond just reading the entry in Board Game Geek, knowing sort of what Axis Empires was like and where it's going to fall, in seeing and projecting where that's going to fall at that point. So I was already excited about this when I got the opportunity, and Sal, being the classy person he is, knows that I don't have the time and resources, really, because I don't have a printer, to do print and play games anymore. And I actually have a stack of them here that are waiting to be assembled. But this wouldn't be too hard to assemble. All you really need is a color printer. And you might even be able to get away with a black and white, because the map is fairly simple and easy enough to read. I think probably that it would work. Anyway. He was classy enough to send me a copy at his own expense, just so that I would do the video. And anyway, I decided I would give it a shot, even though it's just the Russian front, and I've just picked up No Retreat. And this is kind of in that same general type of game, kind of a fairly light, small counter mix. Not necessarily terribly light in rules. These are very dense rules, and there's 8, got to be more than that, 10 pages of real rules, and then scenario, etc. But it's kind of in that very competitive, small, short playing, and it's much shorter than it probably looks if you watch my playthroughs. It probably takes about 15 minutes to do a complete turn once you're a complete month once you're through it. But anyway, it's not really the kind of game that I'm usually attracted to, but I'm so interested in the Unconditional Surrender, in that high level look at all of all of the European theater of World War II, and I hope to hell that it's good enough and well received enough that it gets a Pacific theater coverage as well, because that is what is really needed. Something kind of reminiscent in scale of, say, Hitler's War, but Hitler's War has always kind of failed me. All right, Hitler's War has this really kind of unrealistic movement system that creates really weird situations. All right, so what do we have here for the rules? Well, it's actually, there's not a lot to the turns in the case blue scenario here, which is what's been produced as a print and play, and I really urge people to take a look at this no matter what, but because it is an interesting system, and it's got some really unique mechanisms in it. All right, so you start off with a weather segment, you roll the die, see what kind of weather it is. Those effects will be kind of embedded in all the different aspects. There's no place where you can look up and say, hey, what does severe weather do again? That's one of my gripes on the rules. There aren't these places, at least, where you can refer to the different aspects of it. But okay. I'm very used to learning by reading rather than kind of playing through in a step-by-step fashion. An economics segment. Each player or each power gets a certain amount of economic points from this production chart. The Russian ones are kind of variable based on the number of factories they have, but the German and minor allies are all fixed for every turn. And also I think the Siberian production is kind of kicked in here, where the production goes up in December of 42 by a couple of points. So you can lose a factory there. All right. Then the operations segment, and this is kind of the meat of the game. This is where each player does their movement and combat segment, okay, or combat segments. But it isn't like most of it's not really the I go, you go type structure, and it's not really a pulsed structure. It's sort of a compromise between the two, which I think is very clever. So, and this is similar to Hitler's War. Hitler's War had this, okay, you move a piece and then you move another piece and you take care of its combats and everything. Well, you do that here, sort of. So what you do is you get to choose different kinds of actions. A partisan's action, this is just the Soviet players allowed. There's a special events counter that I have somewhere for the it's on the map that I have for the partisans. It allows them to put that special counter down. That's one of their events counters if they have it in their events box. Okay. Now, when they use it at the end of that turn, it has to recharge, and then I believe that when you roll a die and that many turns later it comes back. That gives you an assault advantage or an attack advantage against that hex as the Russian player or as the Soviets. Air action. Air action allows you to do a couple of different things here. And the two different aspects you can do is you can move an air unit. And air units have to be based either on a road or rail hex or in a city that you control. Moving them costs you a sortie. You'll notice I have these little sorties counters on the air units. Air units go from 0 to 6 sorties, and they become less and less effective as they take more and more friction during the game. All right. The other thing you can do in the air action segment is you can do an air strike. Within 7 hexes of one of your air bases, you just count the hexes out, where you have an air unit. If there's an enemy air unit, you can attack it. And you'll be rolling on the combat table, the air combat section, and that translates over to this sort of general combat table. Everything uses that one table. I don't think there's any real harm to that, but it does mean, and this is almost similar to, well, I'll get into that in a bit. Anyway, and then the third option you have is to take ground actions. Now, you can mix these up in any order you like. A ground action, well, what you're going to do, and this is what's very clever in this game, I think, maybe one of the most clever things that I haven't seen in another game, is you pay one of your economic points, or 2 in the case of a mobile unit, armor, motorized infantry, whatever. And that gives you a bunch of movement points for that unit. You can move each unit only once during your turn, but then you spend the movement points on sort of this normal kind of movement point cost. Hex side and terrain costs, all very normal. With an additional cost if you're going to make an attack on an enemy unit. And that additional cost is modified by what the weather is. So for example, in fair conditions it only costs you 1, but when there's real weather it costs you 2 extra movement points to attack. And you have a pile of movement points. There's no information on these counters basically. They just have a full strength and a reduced strength side. The other information on there's no movement, no combat. There's this is a guards unit because it has this G on here. It's kind of hard to read in the camera, and a U indicates it's an upgrade unit. It'll replace another, in this case a regular infantry unit. I'm not sure all upgrades are going to be from infantry to motorized units. Okay, so they are in case blue, however. So you pick a unit and you activate it and you can move it, and within that movement you pay movement points to make an attack. This is kind of like the pulsed system in, say, Korean War, okay? Except you get to do all your movement and attacks at once, in your phase of the turn, and then your opponent will get to. Now, the attacks themselves will be handled using the ground combat modifiers on that same combat table. All right? There's 2 kinds of attacks, however, with ground units. You can do a mobile attack, which is just the unit that's moving. And there are advantages and disadvantages to this. The biggest advantage is you can kind of make an attack in the midst of your unit's movement and then keep moving. So you can achieve breakthroughs with the unit. And what's more is, no matter what kind of attack you make, you can achieve a breakthrough because you can activate another unit back in the reserves. But each of these activations is going to cost you some of your economic points, which are important for production and for repairing your air units, essentially. Okay, the other type of attack you can make is a more static set-piece battle. And you use these little assault markers. And what you do is you move a unit up next to an enemy, you pay the movement points to attack that enemy, you put a little assault marker pointing at the enemy that you're attacking, and then you end your activation for that unit. Alright? Then you can activate more units. And eventually, sometime during your player turn, you can choose to declare the attack with assault units that you've declared. And the advantage to this is that you can bring multiple units into the attack at once. Okay? And what is the advantage to that? Well, each additional unit adds 1 to your combat modifiers. Combat's all just this pile of modifiers to your die roll. And we'll see how that works in a little bit. But just trust me on this. So now after you've declared your assault, you can only declare it when no unit is active. Okay? You can only actually roll for the attack when no unit's active. And the best you can kind of do with it is gain the 1 hex that you've already paid with the unit that you're assaulting with. So you can add, you don't get to keep moving with a unit after a set-piece battle. There's no pursuit there, although you could conceivably push through in a breakthrough situation. All right, now, after that you go to a supply check subphase. During your own player turn, after you've moved all your units, done all your partisans and air attacks, airstrikes, you are able to, you must check the supply situation of all your units. And that supply degrades, okay? If you're out of supply, cut off from a supply chain, and it's basically 2 hexes to a rail and then back to one of your supply sources. Supply sources are edges of the map, friendly cities for the Russians, I don't think for the Germans. If you're out of supply, you get a little low supply marker, and that's going to affect your combat ability and your movement. I'm not sure about movement points. I have to look that up, and I'm not going to worry too much about it. Yeah, it doesn't say on the counter. If you're already low supply and you're still out of supply, you fall back to the no supply side, which is going to it's going to have your combat effect somewhere over here. Okay. Let's see what else. All right. And if you've got no supply and you're still out of supply, I believe the unit takes a hex loss, a step loss. I've got to take a quick look at the supply rolls because it came in so little, believe it or not, because on your own turn you have the chance to rescue your unit from supply. And that unit can be kind of active, although it's a penalty. There's no question of that. In breaking its way out of a hole, out of a pocket, or also it can move or something along those lines. Now let's look to see if I can find the supply rolls. Low supply has reduced movement. Yeah, so either marker gives you a reduced movement allowance, which is half the normal. The normal movement allowance is 8 for a leg unit and 10 for a motorized unit, including tanks. So let's think. Where am I? Yes. We didn't hit the step losses there. A unit with no supply is reduced in the no supply segment. So if you fall down to the no supply marker, you will take a step loss, but that doesn't happen right away. It happens after both players have taken their turn. That creates a little bit of an unbalance because in this scenario, for example, the Germans get their move first. They could be in supply, cut off a Russian supply unit, and immediately step reduce it. Whereas the Russians, if they cut off a German supply unit, it's not going to receive the step loss at quite the same point in the turn, but both sides get a chance to break their way out. So it's fairly similar. Okay, well after that we'll go to other segments. Replacement segment, where you spend production points to rebuild your units, and you can also spend, this is a biggie, the 3 points to upgrade, to reduce the number of sorties on an air unit. Air units don't take casualties, they take sorties as hits. If they do things, they'll take sorties. If they do unopposed things like a movement, if they do combat, they generally will take sorties here. And you'll see in each case, no matter what, if you fly a combat mission, even an airstrike or a ground support, you're going to take a sortie from the way it works because every result does one sortie to at least one sortie to each side, even if they do combat. Okay. Upgrades, if you've got units in the upgrade box, you can remove them from there and replace a unit on the map. You're upgrading it in this particular game from infantry to these little motorized guard units, which have an advantage on the combat table, as well as paying motorized movement costs, which means more supply and greater distance of movement. Mobilization, you can build units, new units, using the same kind of chart. So for example, activating a unit costs you 1 or 2. Now those units that you activate in general are going to come in, oh no, that's mobilize. Sorry. Activation is when you move. Mobilizing a unit is what happens here. For the most part, a unit costs 1, well, a leg unit costs 1 to come in at reduced strength and 1 more to flip up to full strength. For the Russians, they get it cheaper. They get a full strength one for 1 point. And motorized mobile units costs 2 points to come in at half strength, and then it costs 2 more. Yeah, it costs 2 more to improve that mobile unit. Now, let's see. The other thing, of course, is you can spend 3 points per air unit you have to remove 2 sorties from it. And if you mobilize a new air unit, and the Russians get one in this game, it costs you 3 points to mobilize it with 4 sorties against it. So it's kind of the same cost. It just gives you more flexibility to have more air units. Air units can't fly once they have 6 sorties on them, and they also get penalized. Then you check for victory. Victory in the game is fairly simple. The automatic victory is control all these little factory hexes, and I don't know how many there are. There are a bunch. 1, 2, 3, 4. Looks like 4 of them. And then the turn marker segment, you move the turn forward, and something I forgot about in my last one, eliminated units slip down to the mobilization chart. Anything that's on here gets placed where it belongs, which depends on, is specified in the scenario instructions in some cases, but in terms of event chits, it goes back in the event table, or in the event box, and the like. You also have some potential conditional reinforcements which come in, and they become available due to a conditional event, in this case coming close to Grozny. More Russian units get mobilized in that case. Alright, what about combat? Well, combat's a little... I've already explained a good deal about it, but the actual die rolling on combat this is one of the things that I found very difficult to deal with, but you're using this chart, and you're basically reading down the line, taking into effect every single modifier that applies. And it definitely gave me some trouble in terms of trying to remember the modifiers, but I think after one game of it, I feel somewhat comfortable that if I played another one, I probably would make many, many fewer mistakes, but not none. Certainly if you followed the list, the menu list down each time, you'd be successful, but I have trouble doing that because, I don't know, I'm not good at following instructions. All right. So what you do is you add a bunch of modifiers based on the conditions. So if we take a look at a ground attack, a German unit will get an immediate +2, and that gets marked on here. Okay, this is kind of similar to the reducto ad absurdum type systems that I've seen, and it actually works out very similarly when you take into account assaults, but for the most part, it doesn't really work quite the same. And then, so like a reduced unit has a -2 modifier. That's either attacker or defender. Let's say the defender is reduced, we'd mark that there. And you continue your way through. Air support depends on the weather, but it's either +2, +1, or nothing in severe weather. Air support's useless then, from what I can tell. Terrain is involved in here, everything. So, as you follow down this, you come up with modifiers on both sides. Each side, and it's limited to +10 or -10. Each side rolls a die, adds its modifier, and compares the attacker's value to the defender's value, and gets a result. Now the results vary between an elimination at the high end to retreats and asterisks. Asterisks in ground combat basically mean nothing except in one special case that I didn't see. I didn't get an instance of it, is what I should say. I was aware that it existed. And that's immediately resolved at that point. If the defender, there's one special case that I wanted to point out of these, which is a defender isolated. It's kind of an interesting situation. The defender has to be in a position where they cannot retreat. For example, if they're surrounded by these zones of control. Hey, I forgot to mention zones of control very well. If they're surrounded by these zones of control, they couldn't retreat through them, and so they'd be isolated. But there are exceptions to the isolated bonus, and that's a +2 to the attacker, by the way. The exception to the isolated bonus is if they're adjacent to a friendly city or adjacent to another friendly unit. It doesn't matter what you've got around them. These guys aren't isolated because they're sort of supporting each other. All right, what about zones of control, which I should have caught during movement? Zones of control are a little weird here. They're semi-sticky, which is to say that when you enter one, you have to make a decision. Am I attacking, am I stopping, or am I putting an assault marker down? You can only put an assault marker down if you haven't attacked, and, well, you can't attack in a mobile attack if you put an assault marker down. But what's kind of neat here is if you start in a zone of control, or if you fought around and you want to keep moving, you can move from one unit's zone of control. For example, this German unit here, if I'm in this zone of control, I can move to another zone of control of an enemy unit without, and then I'd have to resolve moving into this new one. I could also move here, make an attack, and then keep moving on from my understanding of the rules. I didn't do that in my game, but that's kind of an idea. Air combat works the same way. When an airstrike is performed, or two air units do air support, you're going to be making these modifier checks and rolling on a die and see what happens. And it's going to be damage and sorties. In the case that you get an asterisk, both sides get their air support in play. If you get a different result, the winning side gets its air support in play. I'm going to pause it now because I'm out of video, but I hope I've got a quicker view of the rules here. I went in more detail and more schlag in the other one.